Today's topic is an interesting one. It's titled Storytelling and Cultural Learning. And basically it's the use of story in culture to convey values. I'll introduce myself. I'm the moderator, and then our guests can go ahead and introduce themselves and speak a little bit about them, and then we'll go from there. My name is Davidson L. Haworth. I've been in the author industry, writing books, since I was out of college. Started working with Dungeons and Dragons, worked for TSR, did a lot of their manuals, creature descriptions, things like that, hero descriptions. Right out of college, then from there I started just writing books for them. Choose Your Own Adventure novels with Rose Estes back in the early 90s, if you've ever read any of those Dungeons and Dragons books. And then from there I left the industry and started writing for commercials and for films. If you've ever seen some of the first Netflix commercials on TV, those were mine. And then from there the recession hit, and I decided to go back into writing novels, but fantasy novels for me is my first love. Been reading Tolkien since I was 6, and Tolkien is a major influence on my writing, and so is C.S. Lewis. So moderating this topic kind of coincides with both those authors who interlaid a lot of their writings with cultural values, if you know Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. So that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and talk to the guests and introduce themselves. Ladies first.
Okay, I'm Juliet Wade, and I've been writing for a while now, I guess. I sold 2 stories this week, which was a shocker for me. But anyway, yeah.
This week?
Yes, in one day.
You're on a roll.
I was in shock. Usually I sell about 1 a year, so all of a sudden I sold 2 in one day, and I was going, what? But anyway, I've been on the cover of Analog 2 times, which is my big claim to fame, I guess. And one of my sales this week was to Analog, so I'm excited they still like me. Let's see, my background is in linguistics and anthropology. And so, I sort of came to this sideways through academia. And my favorite authors, I have a million favorite authors, but I'd say the person who probably influences me the most is Ursula Le Guin. Because I remember the first time that I picked up a book by her, and I thought, wow, you could really feel the culture in the story. And in some of her works, she actually actively incorporates storytelling plot lines into the book to have cultural impact on the place where the story takes place, and it's really amazing. It's sort of meta, I guess. So I've done a lot of study of culture, and also about discourses in culture, and the way that people talk when they want to posture socially. I spend a lot of my time analyzing the things that I read to try to pull social messages out of them. So I guess that would be one of the reasons why I might be on this panel. Happy to be here. Greg?
Shamo Shakis, Misi I'm Gregg Castro, and I'm Total Salinan, rumsien. I'm a California indigenous person. I stopped saying native because then I had all kinds of people saying, well, I'm native too. My parents moved here in 1942 or something. My parents and their precedents had been here a little bit longer, about 15,000 years if you count our version, and longer. And the scientists maybe 12, but a little bit longer. I think that counts as native. And I've been doing cultural work for over 20 years in my tribal community. And a lot of that does involve cultural protection, but it also is cultural heritage kinds of things. And among the way too many things that I get involved in, I was a past director and a current advisor to the California Indian Storytelling Association, which is sort of on semi-hiatus at the moment, while we're looking for additional funding to do more storytelling with. But it's storytelling that has a public component, but it also has a deep cultural preservation part of it. That was really the intent of doing it in the first place. And that's, I think, what we're going to be talking about.
I just want to mention, because you come from that background, is I have a deep fascination for American Indian history. Through high school, they had an elective American Indian courses and to study the history. And the most amazing thing, specifically, you know, in the western part of the United States, is out in the middle of nowhere, you can find petroglyphs out in the middle of the desert. And I love gearing up, going out in the middle of nowhere, searching for Indian petroglyphs. And there are actually some petroglyphs that I found near the town of Bishop, if you're familiar with Bishop.
Oh, yeah.
And
Ohlone.
yeah, and they have petroglyphs there about 10,000 years old. And to think of that, European history here, the missions are the oldest buildings we have really, and they're 1700s. So when you see these petroglyphs, almost 10,000 years old. So think of how amazing that history is from that time period to when the colonists came. It's, you know, it's very fascinating, and I urge people to study petroglyphs and pictoglyphs as well.
Yeah. But leave them there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because sometimes, and it doesn't happen
Yeah,
actually.
don't touch them.
Out there in Bishop, just last
Yeah.
year, there was a big event that happened. I was actually at a cultural preservation meeting where they called in and the Bishop people said, we're not gonna be there. We're busy because somebody went out and took heavy equipment and literally cut the top off of a rock, a huge
Yeah.
rock slab with petroglyphs, and carted it off.
Yeah, and I think that was last year, wasn't
Yeah,
it? That was
last year.
and no,
Mind-boggling,
that
that had never happened before, but it,
was sad.
yes,
That's become a huge issue. I work for the Department of Interior, as you know.
yeah,
And partly because of YouTube and social media, vandalism of pictographs and petroglyphs and rock formations. There was the one just a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
with
Boy
the
Scout
Scout
leaders.
Master.
Yes.
yes.
It's become a huge problem to the point where in our agency, as they do with caves in the Grand Canyon, we're trying to like take some of that stuff off the map.
Right.
You know, so they're not so easily found, unfortunately, because there's no replacing them once they've been painted over with paint that we cannot remove because it absorbed into the minerals or the rock.
Right.
So.
And that might be something we talk about, just the whole idea of cultural misappropriation. In that case, it was pretty drastic, but the idea, it's a big controversy in the Native community about how much we share. I mean, because we're naturally sharing people. It's one reason I'm here. We do storytelling. But then there's always the issue, and it's something that CISA has worked on about, one of our board members came up with the saying, sharing is not giving. Because there are a whole genre of people who do professional storytelling at some level, and they like to take our stories, and to us that's extremely inappropriate. Legal, of course, but inappropriate. And so we've had very hesitant dialogues about that issue. So what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, protocols, etiquette, ethics, those kinds of things.
Let me ask you this. Can you give me an example of inappropriateness? In my latest book, I have a Russian character. And I was on a European book tour, and a Russian person came to me and says, you should not be writing about having any Russian characters at all, because you're not Russian. Only Russians should write Russian characters. So, because they felt that was inappropriate in a way. Not everyone, of course, I'm speaking in generalities, but that one person felt that way. So,
Right.
I mean, how do you feel that way in today's culture? You have people who are not part of that heritage, but writing in regards to that history or that heritage, or in films and books and television.
Right. In that case, my guess is that simply the person was concerned about conveying information accurately. I know that's a issue, and one reason I was urged to become a guest and talk about that, because of the sources of the information that people used for their books. A lot of Native people would say, boy, you came in within the ballpark, but not particularly close. A lot of it is, if you're not Native, if you're not from a particular community, it's really hard to get information, particularly in California, because most people think that all the California Indians are dead anyway. And so they go to their library, poor choice. They remember what they learned in school, even a worse choice. They go to maybe the colleges and get the anthropological texts. Depending on who you read and what their source is, it could be ranged from not too bad to horrible. And so it's a matter of where the source comes from and then how you convey it. That's part of it. And in the case of that, that's what I'm suspecting they're talking about. There is the whole emotional component for particularly California people. That's all I can speak about because I know about them best, is because we had physical and cultural genocide committed on us, and in a way we're still suffering now with cultural genocide, being prevented from practicing our culture, our language. And so we're really sensitive to people taking it outside and kind of using it, what we call abusing it. So that's an emotional component to it, because it's clearly legal, and I've had these discussions at cons before, both sci-fi cons and anthropological cons as well. I think the third component is, I kind of lost my train of thought because that one kind of blows my brain. But just well, there is an etiquette to it for us, and that's more of a cringe for us. It's like, because a lot of these stories, they're very deeply cultural, some are spiritual. And there is a etiquette and protocol within a lot of communities that you only tell certain stories at certain times, and sometimes only told by certain people. And they're usually tied to a certain place. They belong to that people, they belong in that land. So taking them outside that place usually involves permission. And there's a protocol about that, going to ask certain elders, certain family members, is it all right if I tell this story? And then they might say yes or no, but sometimes they'll say, you can only tell this much. You can only tell part of it, the vague part of it, not the details. So there's all that complications that are part of it, and I expect in that case it was just the first case, but there's, for a lot of Native people, there's those other two parts as well.
Sure.
Well, I'll remark that there's a very good book called Writing the Other, and it's by Nisi Shaw and somebody else, and I'm not bringing up the second name. But you should go find it. Sorry?
Cynthia Ward.
Cynthia Ward, thank you. Cynthia Ward and Nisi Shaw, and it's a really wonderful book. And it's talking about diversity in a really engaged way. And I don't want to, I don't want to derail the entire topic of this panel, but one of the points that it makes is that we want to diversify the kinds of characters that we have in stories. So we can't count, it makes no sense to restrict the types of people who can write about types of people. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the people who are writing about them are writing about them to the best of their ability and doing their research, as Gregg suggested, and making sure that they're doing it respectfully, so as to create a community of diversity in fiction as well as a community of diversity in authors and as it is in the world.
I've both become more strident and mellow, and that's one of the ways I've become more mellow. It's just hanging around cons for 30 years and hearing all the arguments, including, I can remember one in particular. The subject, I wasn't on the panel, but just the subject came up, and there was somebody who was an absolute libertarian who's passed over to the other side, and it's absolutely, nobody's going to tell me who to write or what to write or how to write or whatever. I have complete freedom to do that. Okay.
But he has the responsibility to research, study, and put the factual details within his writing. You know what I mean?
That's what my elders would tell me.
Yeah.
That there isn't any divorcing of rights from responsibility, and we would say responsibility first in our culture. So that's the part that often isn't talked about.
Sure.
What's the responsibility, the ethical, moral component of it? Because rights, we pretty much settled that. I've been in enough discussions many years ago of, yeah, they can do it. Okay, should they?
Sure.
Well, and then there's also the question of, and this is one of the things that we see online these days, is the question of there are people out there who are writing things that they are very strident about their freedom to write these things. Okay, but when everybody gets mad they're free to get mad.
Yes.
And if suddenly everybody on the internet starts jumping on you, that's their freedom of speech
That's
too.
right. That's right. That's the funny part to me. It's like, wait a minute, I should have the freedom to. Well, nobody stopped you, did they? And nobody's going to stop me from yelling at you either. So.
Oh, are we doing questions now or not?
Oh, you can go ahead now.
Okay. I'm a youth librarianship student, so it's a really big topic right now about having diversity in fiction, and should it be restricted to the people who are actually of that ethnicity, of that experience, but wanting to have that diversity for children. And I'm just wondering, is there a line, because you want to, especially if there are kids who are descended from a particular culture, but they may not be as connected, as a way to connect them to it. And, is there some, are there is there some kind of publication? Is there a particular house that publishes those? I haven't really seen anything particularly of that nature that's saying, well, we want to put our culture out there.
Right.
And so,
Most tribal communities don't approach it that way, but there's individuals that do, and there's a couple of publishing houses that do, and I'm kind of putting together a list. Boscon wants me to do a presentation, so I got to write something else now. But I'm kind of not ready to reveal, but there are some out there that, Heyday Books is one up here in Berkeley that's does a lot of publishing by native authors, and there's some children's books that they've done lately that are really, really good, in my opinion, because they're culturally specific. So you can certainly learn things being outside that culture, and we encourage other California communities to read those books, because they can certainly get something from it. But it is written from a particular viewpoint of a particular culture.
it's very controversial, for at least in the librarian world, if someone writes a book and it gets an award and it turns out it's an ethnic book and they're not of that ethnicity,
Right.
or even the topic, it's so delicate. The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. It's a huge controversial book,
Yeah.
and it's just, people get, they're very, so it's this weird fine line. I just kind of wondered, where trying to keep the cultural heritage for your children, but not necessarily expose things from the culture you don't want out in the open, like, for anybody to look at.
Right. Well, it's not a hard line, for one thing. And the part that you kind of touched on is that there is a lot of California people that were cut off. I mean, that was the plan.
Mm-hmm.
That was the plan of the Spanish government and then the American government, is to cut off these people from their culture and really destroy their communities and turn them into individuals that they can then become part of the labor force. That's just a small part of that history. And they were very successful at that. So, there are strands of culture that did survive. I was even surprised like that. I mean, growing up from a mission tribe, I was surprised 20 years ago when I first started stepping out and becoming acquainted with other communities out there, which are pretty hidden. Just how much did survive. It's stunning that there are communities out there that have continued their traditions, their practices, their spiritual beliefs, their cultural, sacred, ceremonies, uninterrupted. You didn't know that, right? Neither did I. That was their plan, is to keep people from knowing. And so there are kind of like little oases sprinkled out there, and now they're coming back out, and we're sort of collaborating in cultural ways. I think Sunday we're going to be talking about language. That's a big one right now, is language and basket weaving are two big ones. And basket weaving sounds simple. We talk about it, take a basket weaving in college. Well, it's the opposite. And that is the most complex and most comprehensive way to learn a culture in the Native community. Just learn basket weaving, because you have to know everything, including the stories, because the stories tell you about the land you're from and what's there that you can use for basket weaving. So there's an amazing amount of culture out there, but there's still the specter behind our backs that it's going to be taken away, and that's the emotional component. So I can't give you an answer because we haven't thought of one yet. We're still wrestling with that, even after 20 years of being in CISA, the Storytelling Association. We're still wrestling with that. We archive many of our presentations. You'll never see them, although there is one CD available. Actually have a couple of copies here, just to show. You can get it on their website. It was done by a guy who does radio for Pioneers. They're a senior producer, and he did an hour-long public radio presentation on storytelling. That took a couple of years just to come around to thinking we might want to do it. And all the participants agreed to let it happen. They didn't tell anything deeply crucial about their culture. It was all, they went to their communities said, go ahead. They were very careful about what they said, and it's sort of like free domain. Public knowledge that they were willing to put out there and used however. It took years to come to that. And so it's still a really controversial topic that, although it may sound like not involved, but that incident that happened out where they cut that slab, it's because of public knowledge. This was, I think it was BLM, if I'm not mistaken, BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, federal lands. And so there are federal laws that talk about confidentiality, but it was probably common knowledge out there and no way to protect it. Unless somebody stands there and camps, 24/7. That's not going to happen. So that's the fear we have, and it's a real fear.
Yeah, it's a local, it's on a volcanic table, and there's a lot of space out there, so it's impossible to police. People have to be out there to police itself, basically, in regards to that situation. But it irks me because it's a history that needs to be kept for at least future Californians to learn and to embrace, of the culture and an ancient culture. I kind of want to turn to a different topic because I know there's people in here that, write, stories, or maybe people here who've been published. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter if you write short stories on a fan fiction or if you're a Stephen King. We're all writers and we're all part of the same family, which I think this is part of the reason why a lot of us are here, even at this topic today. My question would be to the panelists: when you're writing your stories, what influences you the most? Is it the culture you've been raised in, inside with your family, the way your parents brought you up and your family brought you up, or is it the outer social culture that you've experienced in your life? What two of the cultures, because a lot of times in the family culture and the societal cultures, sometimes clash. What do you find more useful in your writings to express your stories in regards to the two types of cultures? Ladies first, always.
Two types of cultures. I'm going,
Just two?
are there only two? Yeah, lots of types, in my opinion. And I think that I take most of my own inspiration from my travels. And I wouldn't call that a part of my family culture, except that traveling is part of, I guess, my family's culture, where we travel a lot and we have friends in other countries, and so when we travel, we typically will go to a place and we will stay there and we will put down our little roots temporarily for 2 weeks or maybe 10 weeks or whatever it is, depending on what the opportunity looks like over the course of my existence, right? And basically do sort of like homestays, and I did a homestay for a year in Japan, and I've stayed in Switzerland and in France, and that combined with what I've learned in anthropology has gotten me very interested in the questions of insider viewpoints versus outsider viewpoints, and so when I'm writing a story, I will typically pick a character that I want to focus on, and I will play around with insider and outsider viewpoints. And very often, or at least with the analog stories that I've had out so far, these are alien cultures that I made up with languages that I created. But there is no extricating language from culture. So it's a question of taking the experience that I have had of being plopped down in a place and having to figure out why everybody's actions made sense, and then translating that into an experience that I want to share with other people, where I can create a culture and a language, and I can create a system that makes sense internally, and then plop the reader down and let them kind of figure it out along with me. Because it's been one of the most mind-expanding, aspects of my life, and one of the things that is constantly inspiring to me. And I still, whenever I travel, I find that I'm fascinated, whether it's in the United States or in another country. It's every word that you hear is a hint to an underlying cultural system, and so there's tons to discover there, and that's what most inspires me.
I haven't written much fiction because I don't have time, because I'm doing too much cultural preservation stuff and site protection stuff. And when I do write, it's usually nonfiction things. In fact, knowing Julie would bring her 2 analog books, I brought one too.
Yay!
I co-authored a article in this book, and the article happens to have that as the picture in the front of the article. So there's my claim to fame. The latest thing I did is American Byways. I can't sell it to you because I think it's free. And it's an article I wrote with Dr. Beverly Ortiz, who works for the East Bay Regional Park District. She's a cultural anthropologist, and we wrote this about tribal consultation process. How to talk to Indians, I guess you could say. It's a little more formal than that. Just a tad bit. But the process you might go through logistically and intellectually. The other parts you're on your own, though. And that's mostly what I do. I do have an outline for a story, but to me, fiction